on the subject of Parashat Tisa, I had, I think, a compact point to make, which is just that we've now established through a number of different shiurim about Amalek that there is a symbolic structure behind the narrative element that says, in the war with Amalek, you have Moshe up on the hill holding his staff high with Aaron and Hur helping him hold his hands up and Yehoshua fighting below. And we talked about what that all means previously. What's interesting is that this set of elements is connected to the episode of Egel HaZahav, also the golden calf that we see in Parashat Tisa. And it's connected in a way that provides a kind of commentary on a negative aspect of it. Because what we have previously is the notion that Yehoshua can successfully defeat Amalek if Moshe is holding the staff high and Hur and Aharon are helping him to hold it high. And when we go over to Egel HaZahav, we obviously don't expect that to be a kind of positive example of anything, because that was a moment of failure for the people, for the Am. And indeed, that's what I want to argue, but it's interesting to see how this comes out of the text. So first, I just want to read a few psukim from the episode of Egel HaZahav, of the golden calf, and then we'll see like what it has to do with Amalek necessarily. So this is after the people have sinned, and Moshe has had to sort of go down and start dealing with the problem and shatter the tablets, that whole. So the people have made an idol. They started worshiping it because Aaron made them the idol when they demanded it while Moshe is up the mountain, and Yehoshua comes and speaks to Moshe, and Moshe comes down and then is angry and everything. So all that has happened, and then Moshe is now lobbying HaKadosh Baruch Hu to spare his people and not to punish them as they deserve. So what does Moshe say? And he says, so it says, "Vayashav Moshe el Adonai vayomer, Ana hata ha'am hazeh, hata'a gdola, vaya'asu lahem Elohei zahav. Ve'ata im tisa hatatham ve'im ein, meheni na misifrecha asher katavta. ויאמר אדוני אל משה, מי אשר הטה לי אמחנו מספרי." So what do we just read? It says, Moshe returned to Hashem and said, "Oh, this people have sinned a great sin and made themselves gods of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I beg you, from your book which you have written." And Hashem says to Moshe, "Whoever has sinned against me, him I will blot from my book." So there's this talk of blotting from the book. And this is the thing that I want to pick up on now, because this whole episode, I mean, maybe the first element we could say starts to remind us a little bit of Amalek, although I don't think you could make the case on that basis alone, is that there is mention of Moshe, there's mention of Yehoshua, and there's mention of Aaron, and Moshe is up on the mountain to begin with. But Hur is not being mentioned in this episode directly. So that feels like there's an element missing, although we'll try to repair that in a bit. But also, Aaron, Moshe, and Yehoshua are around almost all the time and mentioned, like finding them together is not so unlikely. So it doesn't really seem like it's very compelling on its own. It gets a little more interesting when we talk about these discussions of meheni na misifrecha, or misifrecha, erase me from your book. The reason that's interesting is because there is another place not far away and earlier in the Torah where we see this verb limhot, to erase, and that's in the fight with Amalek. It says, "Vayhalash Yehoshua et Amalek ve'et amo lefi harev." So Yehoshua is defeating Amalek because the hands are being held high and all of that we described. ויאמר אדוני אל משה, כתוב זאת זיכרון בספר ושים באוזני יהושע, כי מהו אמחה את זכר עמלק מתחת השמיים. And Hashem said to Moshe, write this for a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Yehoshua, for I will completely put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And then it goes on, Vayivin Moshe mizbeach vayikra shemo Adonai Nisi. So, and Moshe built an altar and he called its name Hashem Nisi. Vayomer ki yad al kes yah milhama l'Adonai ba'amalek midor dor. For he said, because Hashem has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Okay, so now we start to have a number of elements that are lining up, because first of all, there's this idea of mehia, of erasure or blotting out. That's one clear connection. Meheni na misifrecha. That's what Moshe says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Erase me from your book. And they have this discussion about, no, Hashem says, I will erase those who sin against me from my book. So there's all this talk about erasure going on. But there they're talking about erasing from a book. Here, with Amalek, you're not erasing Amalek from the book necessarily, but there is mention of writing in a book. Ketov zot zikaron b'sefer wasim be'oznei Yehoshua ki maho imche. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still talking about writing in a book. So there's the idea of a book here that's specifically mentioned, and there's the idea of mehiyah. So there are these two elements that are lining up. And we've talked before about how there are other elements, because there's this idea of mizeh umizeh, right? That there is a description of the holding up of the hands of Moshe when he's holding up his staff, with Aaron and Hur helping him hold up his hands. And what we hear is, וידי משה כבדים ויקחו אבן וישימו תחתיו וישב עליה, ואהרון וחור תמכו בידיו מזה אחד ומזה אחד, ויהי ידיו אמונה עד בוא השמש. So Moses' hands were heavy. They took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the other and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So we have mizeh umizeh, and the idea of stone. He's sitting on a stone. But where else do we hear the word umizeh, right? That actually is something that we also get later on when we're talking about the golden calf, in fact, right? It says, ויפן וירד משה מן ההר, ושני לוחות העדות בידו, לוחות כתובים, משני עבריהם, מזה ומזה הם כתובים. So Moses turned and went down from the mount, and the two tablets were in his hands, and the tablets were both written on their sides, the one side and on the other were they written. This is the moment, actually, when Moshe is going to go down and deal with the scandal of the golden calf that's happening. We haven't heard that in the text yet, but it goes a little further down in Vayishma Yehoshua et kol ha'am v're'o vayomer el Moshe kol milhama b'machane. So there's this somewhat strange statement by Yehoshua now, where Yehoshua says to Moshe, there's a voice of war in the camp. And then that turns into dealing with the golden calf. Moses saying he's angry, throwing down the tablets, shattering them, etc. Or he doesn't say he's angry. The text says he's angry. But I actually want to pick up on this point that Yehoshua is mentioning war for some reason. That comes out of left field, because we don't think of this as a moment that has to do with war up until this point in the text. It's just been telling us about how there's this golden calf that's been made, and the people have been cavorting before their idol and all of that, and then Moshe has been informed about it. Yehoshua suddenly says there's a voice of war. What is this voice of war? What is he talking about? Well, actually, although that must have meaning in this context, and we don't have to explicate that now, the main thing that I want to pull out here is that connects it also back to Amalek, right? Because when we were talking about Amalek, we said that Hashem has this eternal battle with Amalek. And so it's Vayomer ki yad el kesya milhama ladonai ba'amalek midor dor, that Hashem has a war with Amalek from generation to generation. So we have another connection through this mention of war, which actually in the context of Yehoshua at that moment doesn't quite fit or make sense, except that it's drawing this thread to Amalek. So we have Mechia writing in a Sefer. We have the idea of Milhama, which is war. We have Aaron and Yehoshua and Moshe, which again was not so compelling on its own. But the other thing that I want to mention is the idea of anger. Why do I want to mention anger? Because in the context of the golden calf, there is also going to be the idea of Hashem's anger at the people for their creating the golden calf. And if you look at various references to the anger of Hashem, then what you find is that a way of expressing the idea of anger from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is either the word Vayihar, that Hashem became angry, or Hara, that those words, Het Reish, that root in that context is referring to Hashem's anger. And you have this whole kind of struggle that Moshe is now going to be engaged in to try to secure the forgiveness of Hashem that will protect the people from his great anger at them for worshiping a golden calf. And it's interesting, isn't it, that this Het Reish word associated with his anger at them is rather like the name Hur, which is Het Vav Reish. So Hur is missing from this story. He doesn't appear in the story of the golden calf in any explicit way, seemingly, but we do have the idea of a word representing the anger of Hashem at the people for making the golden calf that has the same kind of letter resonance with the name of Hur that's missing from the story. And so it seems like it's still part of this series of things that we've been talking about. We now talked about a few different passages that have our own Hur, Moshe, and Yehoshua, which connect to Amalek, but also to other things. And this seems to be another part of that ecosystem with many connections back to the war with Amalek. But it's kind of this negative example, right? Where it's not about a positive outcome of our successful battle against Amalek, but rather it's about a way that we can fail by worshiping an idol, obviously. And Amalek is not being explicitly mentioned here in the text, but clearly part of what the Torah is trying to do is say, look, here is what happens if the system with our one Hur doesn't work, right? Hur is missing. So instead of Hur, we have Hara, we have the anger of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there are other elements of this, like, for example, right after this Mecheni na misifrecha argument, where Hashem says that he's going to erase those who sin from his book, Ve'ata lech nehe et ha'am el asher dibarti lach. Hine mal'achi yelech lefanecha uveyom pakadi ufakadeti aleihem hatatam. So, therefore now go lead the people to the place which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I will punish their sin upon them. But this word nehe, it's not just leading the people, lech nehe, it's this whole idea of hanaha, right? Le'aniah is to put down. And that verb appears in this element where Moshe is holding his staff up, and it's harama, when he's lifting his hand and holding up the staff, because Aaron and Hur are helping. That's when Yehoshua is victorious against Amalek. And when he is maniach, when he is putting down the staff, that's when he's failing. And here we have a reference to this, the same root of putting down, of resting. And there are other ones actually in the same passage where HaKadosh Baruch Hu's basically saying, like, leave me alone. And it's again a kind of anich, there's a sense of, let me down. And Moshe is saying, I won't, because I'm going to, demand their forgiveness. But the point is that there's this repetition of this idea of putting down. And that also is consistent with Moshe taking the tablets which he flings down, right? He throws them down and they're shattered. And that was connected, mizeh mizeh, with like the idea of his hands being held in the air. And instead, he's taking these tablets, these two tablets, like he has these two hands that were carved with his hands. And instead of sitting on the stone and holding up the staff for the fight of Amalek, he's taking the stone tablets in his hands and throwing them down. So there's this shift towards a decisive hanaha instead of Ramah. So we're not fighting Amalek correctly because Hor is missing. We have Hara of Hashem instead because we have this throwing down instead of this lifting up. And so it's all kind of demonstrating in a sense that by negative example, okay, given the formula of how you beat Amalek, here's a case where you're clearly not beating Amalek. And what does all this add up to? Because in the end, the passage doesn't mention Amalek. So what's the point? The passage is about the golden calf. Why are we talking about Amalek here? I think the point is that it is so central to our success in Avodat Hashem that we do the right things to defeat Amalek. And we talked about this before, because defeating Amalek, the key ingredients of defeating Amalek, since Amalek is the sort of ideological competitor who wants to stop us from claiming our heritage and properly serving Hashem in the land, and all of that we got from the text previously, the way you defeat Amalek is by taking hold of the land, asserting your ancestral claim to it, building a temple on the Temple Mount, and serving Hashem that way, according to his Torah. All of those different elements we talked about before, and that there has to be a government or perhaps a king, Melech HaMashiach, some kind of leadership whose goal is to enable the people to build the temple and to worship Hashem, right? That package is how the Torah says you beat Amalek, right? So in that sense, what we've identified already is that defeating Amalek is not really separable from the full package deal of properly serving Hashem according to his Torah and doing all the things involving sovereignty and involving the temple and Yerushalayim and the land and Hebron and all of that, right? Doing all of those things, that's the same thing as defeating Amalek, but it's really because you're just keeping the Torah correctly and doing the whole thing instead of only the part of it that's convenient or feels safe. To the degree that that's the case, it must also be the case that when you're worshiping an idol instead of Hashem, that you're failing in that mission. And that's what we're seeing here in this example talking about the golden calf. We're seeing that the moment the people start to serve a golden calf instead of Hashem, that they have kicked out one or more of the legs holding up the table of Moshe's hands with the staff in the air, so to speak. We're not going to be able to defeat Amalek because we're bound up in idolatry, and that's going to hold us back and cause us to fail. And that's one of the messages that's coming out of the text to us, even though in that exact moment, the people are not actually fighting Amalek, and it's not making it explicit. The subtext is loud and clear, telling us that if we get bound up in idolatry, then we are going to be punished through our failure to fight off Amalek. And you could run it the other way as well and say, if we're failing to fully fight off Amalek, it might be because we are tangled up in idolatry and not serving Hashem properly. And I think in the present day, we have to reflect on this because we're in a war right now with Amalekim. And I think there's very little question about that. The question of how we defeat them is one we should be asking ourselves. And in positive terms, we've already talked about how part of what that means is building the temple and asserting our unstinting or uncompromising claim to the land of our inheritance and not apologizing for that. Because doing both of those things is both, practically speaking, the best way of dealing what will seem like a defeat to this particular enemy because of what their idols are and what they define as defeat, but also because that's the definition of victory and the definition of success that the Torah gives to us. But we also can think of it now in the negative example and say that if we are somehow not succeeding in that mission, Well, in one sense, it could simply be that we're not doing certain parts of it, right? Where we're not trying to assert greater claim to Har-Bayit at the moment. It, B'ezrat Hashem, will be different soon because that would be perhaps the best way of showing Hamas and the much broader movement that they represent that's opposed to full Judaic sovereignty in the land of Israel around the world, showing them that they're not going to win and showing them that we understand the importance of our symbols to us, right? We could be doing that, but it's also possible for us to understand that even leaving that positive plan out of the picture, that we're going to fail whatever it is we're trying to do in defeating Amalek if we are enslaved to idols. And that is a harder kind of subject to face because that has to do with what we're already doing, right? It doesn't just have to do with what we could do but haven't maybe had the courage to do yet, or don't have the national resolve or unity or whatever else it is to take on. So leaving aside something as central as Har-Bayit, we could say, all right, given, when you take a look at what we are doing, how we're fighting this war, are we fighting it with the confidence that if we do what's right by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then he'll do right by us? Or are we fighting it with one or more hands tied behind our backs because of our subjugation to foreign idols, right? To the foreign idols of whatever incoherence and ultimately perverse and non-uniformly applied standards of international law other countries are demanding that we fight according to, or whatever codes of what are sometimes called ethics, or for that matter, rules of engagement that we're saddling our soldiers with, and thereby preventing them from properly protecting their own lives or the lives of the Jews that they're fighting to defend, because they're not being given the freedom that the Torah would give them to prosecute the war to completion and to fight the enemy the way the enemy must be fought and deserves to be fought, right? These constraints come directly from the frustration of our leaders, both our leaders in government and our leaders at the top of the army, to standards that are being handed to us essentially by the idols of foreign powers, right? These are not principles and notions that are derived from our Torah. They are derived from, let's say, philosophy of the 19th century kind of post-Christian Enlightenment. They're derived from even less impressive sources that have more to do with the changing winds of world opinion, where we sometimes can't do things simply because it seems like it would be unpopular, and we can't contemplate doing things because we think it'll make other people angry, and we're not even sure which God of theirs is making them care, but we'll sign on the dotted line and tie that hand behind our back as well. Or we're not doing it because we ourselves are in a sense so far down the path of developing our own notion of what our moral system means that we are using the Jewish experience in Europe over the last close to 2,000 years as this kind of funhouse mirror to reflect it back to ourselves, and we end up convincing ourselves that our morality must somehow comport with and align with whatever it is that you get from reasoning through the lens of Christian ideology. There's all sorts of ways in which you can identify aspects of decision making and how we're fighting this war, where you see constraint being placed on our armies and how, or on our soldiers and on our army and how it can fight, that are shackles coming from, again, as we said, the subjugation of our leaders to standards that originate outside of the Torah, outside of the system of morality that we're meant to be learning from and that we're meant to be teaching the rest of the world about. So that doesn't exhaust the subject of what can be done about that, but I do think it's an important shadow to detect in the background of the story of the golden calf, that the Torah understands that idolatry as a failure to properly serve Hashem is going to directly lead to our inability to succeed completely in our battle against our greatest enemies, because at the end of the day, serving Hashem properly is the formula for total victory, and anything that subjugates you to other standards and other gods is the equivalent of failing to have the knockout combination that's needed to defeat Amalek, and instead incurring the anger of Hashem that will bring with it the punishment of incomplete success.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.